You all look great. The end of the Republic has never looked better.
We can be.
We must be.
The first generation
to end extreme poverty.
The generation
most determined
to fight injustice and inequalities.
The generation that saves the planet from climate change.
And this is how it will get done. The global goals.
A 15-year plan
for everyone, everywhere.
With no one left behind.
We will live in a world
where nobody,
anywhere,
lives in extreme poverty.
Where no one
goes hungry.
Where no one wakes in the morning
asking if there will be food today.
We will live in a world where no child has to die of
diseases we know how to cure. And where proper health care
is a lifelong right for us all.
We will live in a world where
everyone goes to school.
And education gives us the knowledge
and skills
for a fulfilling life.
We will live in a world where all girls and all women have equal opportunities
to thrive
and be powerful
and safe.
We cannot succeed if half the world is head down.
We will live in a world
where all people can get clean water
and proper toilets
at home, at school, and at work.
We will live in a world where
there's sustainable energy for everyone.
Heat, light,
and power for the whole planet.
Without destroying the planet.
We will live in a world where economies prosper.
And new wealth
leads to decent jobs
for everyone.
And we will live in a world where our industry,
our infrastructure, and our
best innovations
are not just used to make money, but to make all our lives better.
We will live in a world
where prejudices and extremes of inequality
are defeated.
Inside our countries
and between different countries.
Where people live in cities and communities
that are safe, progressive,
and support everyone who lives there.
Where we replace
what we consume.
Planet where we put back
what we take out of the earth.
We live in a world that is decisively rolling back the threat of climate
change.
Where we restore and protect the life in our oceans and seas.
Where we restore and protect
life on land.
The forests,
animals, the earth itself.
With peace between and inside countries.
Where all governments are open.
And answer to us for what they do at home and abroad.
And the justice rules.
With everyone equal before the law.
Where all countries and we their people
work together
in partnerships of all kinds
to make these goals a reality
for everyone, everywhere.
These are the United Nations global goals
for sustainable development.
Let's get to work.
Let's make it happen.
Beyond the waters under the jurisdiction of coastal countries lies a vast region that few will ever see firsthand, but on which everyone on Earth depends. It's known as the high seas and covers nearly half of the planet. These waters and the deep seabed that lie beneath them were once thought to be empty, but they are actually full of life. Sea turtles, whales, sharks and migratory fish spend much of their lives in these waters. They are also home to hydrothermal vents, unique seamounts and geomorphic structures, deep-sea corals, uniquely adapted fish species, and tiny organisms, many of which have yet to be discovered. The high seas are vital to the global ocean ecosystem, providing much-needed protein to a growing population. Nearly 10 million tons of fish are caught each year on the high seas, generating more than $16 billion once landed. And the fishing and shipping industries rely on the high seas to provide economic security and jobs. But the high seas are under threat. As shipping and fishing industries continue to grow and new activities such as rocket launches, power generation, aquaculture and seabed mining emerge, the demands on the high seas are an increasing burden. While shipping, mining and fishing are regulated by international organizations, there is still no management for many new activities or coordinated governance of existing high seas industries. In June 2015, the United Nations agreed to begin negotiations over a new international treaty to protect high seas biodiversity. This treaty is the first of its kind for how our valuable ocean resources are managed. The new treaty could allow countries to protect important and vulnerable parts of the high seas by creating marine protected areas and reserves. And it could require environmental impact assessments for commercial operations to determine when, where and whether various activities should be allowed. Achieving a strong treaty will need the efforts of government leaders and officials from around the world, and broad support from those who make their living from the ocean, feed their families from it, or just love it. Now is the time to secure a robust new international agreement that ensures the health of the high seas for generations to come.
What are the SDGs? In 2015, world leaders from 193 countries agreed the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, the world's new action plan for the next 15 years to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, fight inequality, tackle climate change and achieve sustainable development for all. The SDGs follow the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, agreed in 2000 in a global coordinated attempt to tackle development issues. As a result, the number of people living in extreme poverty has declined by more than half compared to 1990. More girls and boys go to primary school than ever before, and far more people have access to water and essential medicines. But progress of the MDGs has been mixed. Today, over 800 million people still live in extreme poverty. They are also most vulnerable to the increasing impacts from climate change and environmental degradation. Years of hard-won progress fighting poverty could easily be wiped out by even small conflicts, economic crises, or natural disasters. Also, Sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia consistently achieved less progress than other regions. The MDGs measured success on national averages, often missing what happened with marginalized groups like people with disabilities, indigenous groups, rural communities, and women. The international community recognized the new challenges and that human prosperity must go hand in hand with protecting the planet. After a 3-year participatory process, world leaders finally adopted 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So what are these goals for? They are end poverty for all, freedom from hunger, health and well-being, quality of education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, sustainable energy for all, decent work and economic development, innovation and resilient infrastructure, reducing inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, sustainable consumption and production, action on climate change, healthy oceans, sustainable ecosystems, peace and justice, global partnerships. There are 4 underlying principles that come with the SDGs and that are transformational in the way we work on development in the future. Firstly, the SDGs are universal. They apply to every country, rich and poor, north and south, developed and developing. They recognize that global challenges like tackling climate change and changing models of development require global solutions. Domestic policies that look at these issues in one country will have an impact on other parts of the world, so we need to coordinate. Secondly, they integrate all dimensions of sustainability: economic development, social progress, and environmental protection. For example, they tell us to grow enough food for all without destroying the soil or overusing water, to develop our economies without increasing inequality, or to produce enough electricity for all without pumping more CO2 into the atmosphere. This is similar to what Pope Francis says in his encyclical. We are faced not with 2 separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. The SDGs tell us we should leave no one behind. Governments have agreed no goal should be met unless it is met for everyone, including those in society most vulnerable and hardest to reach. So education must reach indigenous communities, jobs created for women and men, quality healthcare available for all rural communities, and water and sanitation facilities accessible for people living with disabilities. Tackling exclusion is the key to tackling inequality. And finally, the SDGs require the participation of all. The process to agree the SDGs took years and included national dialogues, consultations with civil society groups, the private sector and academia, and ended with negotiations between all governments at the UN. There's a strong sense of ownership of these goals. The result is ambitious, but it reflects what the world wants.
Well, they say that the pen is mightier than the sword. And for some time now, men have been able to conquer lands with the swoop of a pen. And they justify this by so-called preservation and for the greater good, when in all reality this is just another tactic of warfare. And it is backed up by a militarized police force, a militarized bureaucracy at this point, ready to drop the hammer on anyone that stands in their way. You will hear things like, this is for the desert tortoise. This is for the greater good. It really just comes down to money, control, power, greed, and resources. They are coming after the natural resources, and they're not going to let you stand in their way. They will sell you out without even blinking an eye. You see, they have a playbook and a plan that has been in place for a long time. It used to be Agenda 21. Now it has transformed and evolved into the 2030 Agenda that was launched just last year in Manhattan at the UN headquarters, at the UN General Assembly. The 2030 Agenda at this point has two main focuses. These are their loopholes and how they figure they will be able to conquer the world, literally. Everyone on it, control them and all of its resources for their own financial gains and beyond. Sustainable development and climate action. No, I'm not here to try to prove or disprove global warming in this video right here. That's not the point. But I don't think anyone can deny that the threat of global warming, what they're pushing to be the end of civilization as we know it, will be used to their advantage for a total and complete takeover. And if you disagree with that, well, then you'll be ridiculed and threatened. And they will try to normalize the attacks on you. And not only will they make a fortune in doing so, they will also gain immense power because they will be able to regulate and mitigate every aspect of you in your life, in your town, your country, your state, under international law. And it's not just the land and the resources in the land that they're coming after. They want it all. They're coming after the oceans as well. That's right. They want half of the planet with this one move alone. 2/3 of this planet's oceans, they are trying to get complete and total control over. And of course, it's all for the greater good because man doesn't know what they're doing. They're such a bad guy. They're out of control. When if you look at it, the governments crack down on the regular Joe. But meanwhile, these corporations and mega corporations and multinational corporations are allowed to run rampant, causing man-made disaster after man-made disaster. Let's take a quick look at exactly what is being proposed here by the United Nations. And again, let me reiterate that the Obama administration is playing a key role in this. So it states right here off the top, the United Nations has launched a far-reaching initiative that would give the UN-sponsored authorities sway over biological resources in the ocean, specifically all the waters that lie outside of the national territories and economic zones. And that would look something like this. As you can see, each country has some territorial waters immediately off their borders. As you can see here, this is a multi-trillion-dollar issue, and they are looking to designate around 30% of the world's international waters as no-go areas under the guise of protecting them for biological diversity. Now, a lead senior official for the National Resources Defense Council, the NRDC, stated, "This treaty looks to cover 2/3 of the ocean, which is almost half of the planet, in this one single move alone." And the NRDC is the lead member of a squadron of 33 environmentalist groups that have come together under the High Seas Alliance to lobby for protectionist measures during these talks. Now, if you look right here, that is their calling card, the Squadron of 33. Let's take a look at exactly who is involved with the National Resources Defense Council. Now, I'm going to give you one guess real quick where this is going. The Natural Resources Defense Council is being backed by hedge fund billionaires like Tom Steyer and others. And as you can see right here, the NRDC also receives considerable funding from the more traditional liberal foundations such as the George Soros-backed Open Society Institute and Foundation to Support Open Society. They've donated over $2.2 million since 2008 alone. And the list goes on. Now, so there you have it. Natural Resources Defense Council backed by Soros and others. This is who is working with the UN to take over the oceans. Let's move on, shall we? Now, they go on to explain in this Fox News article the rationale behind the discussions of why they want to take over the planet's oceans. And of course, it's to ease the rising pressure on the biodiversity, like overfishing and pollution and drainage of nutrients, and all those things are legitimate concerns without a doubt. Well, you can see right here that at the end they tuck in, including underwater exploration of hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons, huh? Well, what's that? Let's take a look. Well, wouldn't you know it, the majority of hydrocarbons found on planet Earth naturally occur in crude oil. Do you see where this is going? This treaty is being referred to as the saltwater equivalent of the Paris Agreement on climate change. And at the UN headquarters in Manhattan, New York, into a global, international, permanent, and legally binding law. This is where the global taxation is going to take effect, for example. This is where the global regulations and mandates will supersede and trump the Constitution if they are ratified. And let me remind you, the Obama administration is working very closely with the United Nations in all of this. Their headquarters is in New York and was given to the UN by the Rockefellers. And as I stated before, this is all part of the 2030 agenda. As you can see, one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals is ocean biopreservation. Now, back in 2014, President Obama signed an executive order for the Remote Pacific Islands National Marine Monument in the Central Pacific Ocean. They have made some big moves here already before this UN treaty came on the table. And as you can see right here, here's Hawaii, and basically between Hawaii and Australia, this huge area of ocean is now being quote-unquote protected under this executive order. And as you can see, it's all been broken down into bits and pieces. Now, if you scroll down here, let's take a look. You can see mining and drilling. There it is. That whole area is extremely rich in resources. And it's not just the governments that are involved in this. It's NGOs, it's lobbyists, and so on. And they're looking to make moves all over the place, as you can see here off the coast of New England. Now, one of the major contributors to this is Pew Charitable Trusts. And they have been lobbying governments around the world for years to create these no-go zones, basically, to take over them under the guise of biodiversity protection. Well, let's take a look at Pew Charitable Trusts. They sound great, right? They want to protect the environment and save the whales. Well, let's see. Okay, they are comprised of 7 individual funds established between blah, blah, blah. Oh, look, the founder of Sun Oil Company and his wife, Mary A. Pew. So the founder of this oil company wants these no-go exclusion zones. And this is all being backed by the UN. Let's see who they have worked with in the past here. Now, I'm not going to list them all, but you can see right here, they have worked in the past with the Open Society Institute. That's George Soros. They have worked with the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, and many others. They are all lobbying tens of millions of dollars to influence and sway politics and legislation down to the local level all the way to the international global level. And for those of you that are not familiar with those foundations, those are the big dog players in all of this. They can be referred to as the power behind the throne, the shadow government, if you will. So Sun Oil Company is now Sunoco, which is an American petroleum and petrochemical manufacturer, one of the largest gasoline distribution companies in the United States, formerly a Fortune 100 company. Now, that company was founded by Mr. Pew, the same guy who founded the Pew Charitable Trusts, who lobbies governments around the world for years to get these exclusion zones, these no-go zones on behalf of the UN in these mineral and resource-rich areas. You tell me what their motive is. They can create foundations that lobby and donate tens of millions of dollars, and then they can turn around and make billions and trillions and do it in the name of protecting and preserving the environment, all while they get a monopoly on all of the resources. Now, this is an old map right here. This is a proposal for a global network of marine reserves covering up to 40% of the world's oceans. Now, to my knowledge, the UN has not yet released a map showing the 2/3 of the ocean, or half of the planet, that they want to lock down under their control exclusively. But I guarantee you, if you take a look at the world map as far as natural resources go, they will probably be very similar. So just to recap, the 2030 agenda is real. It's here. It's big time. They are making big moves. They have established the framework legally on paper for global governance. This is a multifaceted attack on people around the world and our inherent rights to be free. They're going to try to sell it to you as a necessary means. They have to do this because of the crisis that we are in right now. Well, you know what? If you know anything throughout history, the majority of these crises that we are experiencing are manufactured. These crises are created to serve their end game agenda. This is what's known as a false flag, and it's taking place right now on a global scale. They want us to be so busy fighting each other about race, religion, whatever, sports, left, right, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, that we will never see where the real threat is coming from. And that's from the very top. But let me tell you, never forget this. The people have the power. We have the numbers. And at the end of the day, we are all in this together.
Is the UN 2030 agenda, which we did talk about a little bit last year when it was rolled out at the United Nations General Assembly last September. But this, of course, is a development of what was formerly Agenda 21 and is just a furtherance of the same goals for the same ends. And we're going to be talking about another aspect of this, not the Paris Climate Agreement, but a different United Nations push that is ongoing at the moment. And this relates to something called Resolution 69-292, aka Development of an International Legally Binding Instrument under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea on the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Marine Biological Diversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction. One wonders why these types of UN General Assembly resolutions don't get a lot more media play. Maybe it's because they're hitting behind gobbledygook like that. But here to break down the gobbledygook, Spiro, thank you for joining us today on the Corbett Report.
Thank you for having me, James. It's great to be here.
All right, that was a long-winded introduction, but perhaps you can cut through some of the gobbledygook that we're talking about here. As I say, this UN General Assembly resolution is not very easily parsable from its title. Tell us what this resolution is about.
Well, this is one portion of the 2030 agenda. And as you said earlier, the 2030 agenda was rolled out at the end of last year in Manhattan, New York, at the UN headquarters there. Now, this new portion that is being rolled out is going after the oceans. They've already used sustainable development. They're rolling out the climate change aspect of it. And this is geared towards that climate initiative that they're looking to push. And what it is it's a far-reaching initiative by this UN that is being brokered and negotiated with closely by the Obama administration to what they say, quote unquote, to preserve biological resources. But what it really is a massive grab, land grab, ocean grab this time, where mega corporations, multinational corporations are going after the resources, and they're going to designate large portions of the ocean as no-go zones.
So tell us about who is involved in this, because of course the idea here that is given to the general public is that these types of UN General Assembly resolutions are being administered by angels descended from heaven to rule over the world benevolently. But oddly enough, there are some interesting organizations that are on board with this resolution and its attempt to create these no-go areas in the oceans. So tell us about some of the groups that are behind this.
Well, one of the main players in this is the National Resource Defense Council, the NRDC. Now, they work as a squadron of 33 environmentalist groups known as the High Seas Alliance. Well, this Natural Resource Defense Council has somewhat of a shady background when you start to look into their funding. I mean, they always say follow the money, right? Well, of course, they're being funded by hedge fund billionaires such as George Soros, and the list goes on. So that right there raises some big red flags to me, because they are working hand in hand with the United Nations and the Obama administration to get this one aspect of this 2030 agenda pushed through while everyone's worrying about Trump and Clinton.
Exactly right. The big boys are playing at the big table. All right, Soros being behind one of these types of shadowy groups should be no surprise to anyone in my audience by this point, but you also unearthed some interesting information about something called the Pew Charitable Trust. What is this wonderful benevolent organization?
Well, of course, they want to save the planet on the surface, and they make what their intent, they make their intent sound like it's really great. You know, something like, how could you be against what they're doing? And to break it down, Pew Charitable Trusts basically is a massive group that's been lobbying tens of millions of dollars to sway and influence politics and legislation from the local level all the way up to international levels. And when you look into the background of the Pew Charitable Trusts, you see that the founder, Joseph N. Pew, is the same Joseph N. Pew that is the founder of the Sun Oil Company, which is now Sunoco.
I don't get it. An oligarch behind one of these environmental save-the-world organizations? I never imagined it. No, of course I did know this because I've been doing a lot of research on this topic recently in preparation for my Big Oil sequel. But let's try to break this down for people. Why is Big Oil interested in these UN General Assembly resolutions that can help to confiscate, essentially, large sections of the world's surface?
Well, when it comes down to it, the way I see it, it comes down to power, control, money, greed. And you take things like this, the TPP, for example, which has secret tribunals, which is being overseen by the UN Security Council, I might add. This is another aspect. It all kind of ties together. Then you have the climate agenda. Then you have the sustainable development. And what they're doing, what it appears to they're doing, is they're setting up a massive monopoly over everything for that control of the resources. And the way I see it playing out is they're setting the stage and the framework to establish legally on paper through international law global governance. So it'll give them the ability to regulate and tax any country, any person, any nation into obedience.
The agenda here is so large that it's difficult for most people to get their head around, because it really is about control of the planet itself, the entire planet and all of its resources. That is the ultimate end goal of this, and it's being done section by section, piece by piece, methodically so. And it's just difficult for people to understand this. And the first order of understanding, I think, as you say, is the monetary aspect of this. Obviously, there is unimaginable amounts of wealth to be gained from this monopolization of the planet's resources. The Ocean Biodiversity Treaty resolution itself, as you've noted in your video, is to the tunes of trillions of dollars. Let's talk about the monetary aspect of this and the monetary incentive for these types of corporate foundations and other things to try to monopolize the planet's resources.
Sure. Well, Pew Charitable Trust, for example, if you look at some of their business partners in the past who they've worked with, it consists of the same type of Soros groups, Carnegie Foundations, and others. Ford foundations, when they lobby tens of millions of dollars, they are able to turn that investment around and make hundreds of millions, if not trillions of dollars by getting exclusivity to these resources and these areas. No-go zones. No one can go there and do their private exploration. They say specifically in this UN, this next phase of this UN agenda here, the 2030 agenda, that first they list all of, yes, we're going to protect, we're going to stop overfishing, and we're going to do all these great, wonderful things that sound reasonable, something that most reasonable people would endorse. But then at the very bottom there, they tuck in hydrocarbon exploration. And when you look into, okay, well, what's hydrocarbons? Well, hydrocarbons are found on Earth, naturally occurring in crude oil. And that's where they are found in their largest capacity. And so then that starts to connect the dots for me when I see Pew Charitable Trusts lobbying to push for these no-go zones, because they're an oil company, they're a gas company.
Yes, and I note on that very note that the Pew Charitable Trust spokesperson, Elizabeth Wilson, is quoted as saying that although they want to set aside 30% of the world's oceans or whatever for preservation purposes, she says, direct quote, although not completely no-take, no-use areas, ... i.e., yeah, we're going to monopolize what can and cannot be taken, and we're going to get our share out of there. So as I say, obviously there is a monetary incentive here, and quite an obvious one, but I think it's more important to get to the deeper level of this, because it's not just about the money. It is also, as you say, about the control. Tell us just briefly about Agenda 2030 and the agenda of control that it represents.
Well, as you stated earlier, James, the 2030 agenda is basically an expansion of the Agenda 21. And it is a far-reaching, far-encompassing globalization agenda. And everything from a global police force has been announced at the last UN General Assembly in Manhattan. Biometric identification on a global scale has been talked about, pushed by the UN, backed by the World Bank, sourced out to private contractors. But basically, what they're going after, they're going to use the main two focus points of the 2030 agenda is sustainable development and the climate action. They're going to be able to implement global taxation and regulate and mitigate every aspect and portion of our lives. So I'm not here to argue whether the global warming is real or not. That's not the issue right now for this conversation here. The issue is they're going to use the fear and the threat of these crises to implement full, total domination and control of every aspect of our lives.
Unfortunately so. And again, people can look at, James Evan Pilato and I covered this on New World Next Week last year when they initially rolled this out, and others like Truth Stream Media have done some good videos on the 2030 agenda and what it boils down to. But it has, of course, it's wrapped up in feel-good, wonderful rhetoric about feeding the world's poor and all of that sort of stuff that, of course, everyone wants to do. But it's always the question of how do you go about doing that? And monopolization of the world's resources in the hands of the few select crony corporate foundations that are sponsoring this at the UN level is probably not the best way to do that. I think we can all agree.
The Convention on Biological Diversity has set a target to protect 10% of the oceans in marine protected areas by 2020. That target has been picked up as a UN Sustainable Development Goal, so we really do feel that we need to be protecting a tenth of the seas by 2020. But is it enough? There's been a great deal of interest and controversy over how much of the sea we really need to protect in order to safeguard life there and maximize other benefits to humanity, like producing productive fisheries, for example, avoiding some of the problems of adverse evolution that happens to fish stocks when they're exploited intensively, avoiding problems of collapse in ocean processes as well. What our study clearly shows is that protecting a few percent of the seas is just not enough. It also very strongly shows that protecting 10%, the current international target, is not enough either. In fact, really, we can only begin to start saying that we're doing the right thing when we get above 20%. And the optimum level of protection is above 30%. So I would say that we need to be protecting something like a third of the seas from exploitation and harm. If we get it right, life will be safeguarded well into the future, species won't go extinct, and fisheries will continue to thrive. If we get it wrong, we're going to see an increasing amount of dysfunction in the sea, collapses of populations there, harmful algal blooms, beaches becoming too contaminated for us to use. All of these things are possibilities. If we get it wrong, then we will lose things that have been taken for granted since time immemorial. The oceans have done things for us that we don't even know existed. They've kept us healthy, they've kept the water clean, they've processed our wastes, and we didn't notice it was going on. That's because it was happening. If it stopped happening, we'd very quickly notice. Very few of the studies that we looked at set out trying to answer the question of how much of the sea that we should protect. Instead, they looked at little pieces of the problem and saying, well, let's say in the Great Barrier Reef, how much of this area should we protect in order to safeguard life here? And so what we've done is to extrapolate from their results, to blend the results from a whole variety of different approaches that people have taken, and to come up with a big picture figure. It is possible to scale up from one place to another. You can go from small to larger, as long as the figures scale appropriately across that range. And I think that they do. One of the things you might think in this kind of study is that the answer for fishing would be very different for the answer for nature conservation. So people might say it's all right to protect 30 or 40% of the oceans to protect nature, but if we're going to fish productively, then we can't protect anything like that much. One of the really interesting findings from the study is that the amount that we should protect to benefit fisheries, forgetting all about nature conservation, is the same. It's up there in the range of 30 to 40%. So safeguarding fisheries and safeguarding nature are not incompatible at all. We can achieve them both by creating the same networks of marine protected areas. When people hear a figure of 30 to 40% of the oceans being protected, it seems to them just far too much. And then they'll say, well, it's impossible to do that, or you're crazy. But maybe we were all crazy thinking that we could get by without protecting that much of the sea. If you think about it, for the great majority of the history of planet Earth, ocean life has thrived without any human exploitation. Now we're chasing them down with industrial fishing boats, and is it a surprise that they can't cope? In fact, really, we'd be crazy to think that we could get by and safeguard life in the sea and the fisheries and the livelihoods that depend on it with anything less than 30 to 40% protected. Numerical targets are controversial, and they've been criticized by people who say that we're placing quantity before quality. We need quantity and quality though, and I think what percentage targets have done is to really motivate and energize action to establish protected areas in the sea at a rate and scale that we've never done before.
President Obama has decided to quadruple the size of a federal marine preserve around his home state of Hawaii by an executive order issued yesterday. The Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument will become the largest ecological preserve on the planet, encompassing more than 580,000 square miles of land and sea. For more on the area and species that will be protected, I'm joined now by Matt Rand, director of the Pew Charitable Trust's Global Ocean Legacy Project. So Matt, tell me, why this patch of ocean? What's so special about it?
Well, this is an amazing place in the Pacific Ocean. The Northwest Hawaiian Islands, or Papahanaumokuakea, is a very special place. Over 7,000 marine species, talking about the oldest living organism on Earth. A deep sea coral that's 4,500 years old is found here. Ghost octopus, creatures that are endemic, found only in this stretch of ocean. Up to 90% in certain locations are only found in this stretch of the ocean. And then, of course, all the magnificent megafauna that everybody sees in the National Geographic films, like whales and turtles and sharks and manta rays, and the amazing seabird life as well. So it's a spectacular piece of ocean, and we are so excited that it's now been protected in perpetuity.
So how do you protect, say, schools of fish from this area that decide to go outside and back in, right? I mean, this is one of the concerns that the fishing industry has had for some time.
There are some certain species that definitely go beyond these borders, but while they're in this huge refuge, and it's a massive refuge, about 3.5 times the size of the state of California, these fish have an opportunity to reproduce and grow unmolested. So they have an excellent chance of passing on their genes and repopulating.
And put this in perspective of the larger ocean. I mean, while we talk about 3 times the size of California, put that in perspective for all the ocean that's sort of not protected this way.
Yeah, scientists are saying that we need to protect up to 30% of the ocean. And currently right now, in highly protected or fully protected marine reserves, we have about 3% of the ocean. So we still have a very long way to go. That said, we've come a very long way in a very short time frame. In fact, when Papahanaumokuakea was first designated in 2006, the first version of it by President Bush, that was the largest protected area in the world, and we were down around 0.05% of the ocean protected just 10 years ago. And now we're at 3% of the world's oceans protected. And this, of course, really sets a standard for the rest of the world and hopefully a wake-up call for the rest of the world that we need to start taking bold action like the president just took.
What took it so long? Why the gap in years between when George Bush started this and when President Obama expanded it?
There's new scientific information that has just come out in the last decade. It's really not that long when you think about it from the scientific perspective. They didn't know about the world's oldest living organism or the fact that these endemic sea creatures were found out in these further distances. And they also didn't have as much scientific information about the importance of the large scale and the interconnectivity between all the different species and their need for such a wide range for protection. And then the spiritual and cultural connection to the Native Hawaiians has really come to the forefront as well.
Matt, put this kind of a space in the context of climate change. What's the value?
Yeah, scientists are very excited about this area being protected now. Fully intact ecosystems are much more resilient to the impacts of climate change. And in this particular location, they're very excited that it will be one of the, if not the best, largest climate refuges, certainly for the ocean, but also for the planet. It's situated in the tropics, but also in the temperate ocean, and actually to the further northern end of the island chain and the now protected marine reserve, the water actually becomes quite cool. So the scientists are hopeful that as the waters of our ocean continue to warm and become acidified, that this area will hopefully be a climate refuge where we'll have species of not only coral but also fish that are threatened from the changing of our ocean temperatures and the acidity. So it will hopefully, as things change, continue to be resilient and will certainly be a huge refuge for wildlife.
From the Pew Charitable Trust Global Ocean Legacy Project, Matt Rand, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
In the wake of the papal-inspired United Nations Agreement on the Environment, the United Nations has launched a far-reaching initiative that could give the UN control over the biological resources of the high seas, which is all the waters that lie outside of national territories and economic zones. It involves multi-trillion-dollar issues, including the protection of biological diversity, major impact assessments, and projects like the development of marine genetic resources. Overall, the hoped-for treaty will cover 2/3 of the oceans, almost half the planet, said Lisa Spear, a senior official of the National Resources Defense Council, or the NRDC. The foundation for the treaty, which they hope to have drafted by the end of 2017, is based on the problems related to overfishing, pollution, the drainage of nutrients and other substances from the surrounding lands, the disturbance of underwater seabeds, etc. Some see the treaty as the saltwater equivalent of the Paris Agreement on climate change, a global, permanent, and legally binding deal for the management of the Earth's last frontier. One of the things we're looking at is how marine genetic resources will be conserved, sustainably used, and how the dividends will be shared, said Spear. The Obama administration is deeply involved in the negotiations, as are some of the world's most powerful environmental organizations. The United States strongly supports conservation and sustainable use of the ocean and its resources, both within and beyond national jurisdiction, a State Department official told Fox News. That includes increased cooperation and coordination among states, international bodies, and relevant stakeholders to achieve better conservation and management of the high seas resources. Environmentalism is one of the key principles that Papal Rome uses to unite the world under her moral guidance. The United Nations will be the global coordinator of papal plans and objectives.
So there's no conflict between a healthy economy and a healthy planet. And that's why I've committed, along with Canada and Mexico, to get 50% of U.S. electricity from clean sources by 2025. And with many of our biggest businesses switching to clean energy, I'm absolutely confident that we can meet that goal. But that's not all. I've also made sure we're better prepared for the impacts of climate change, because even as we need to hit the brakes so that we don't go over the cliff, we're not going to come to an immediate stop. We know that there is still going to be an inevitable impact as a consequence of rising temperatures. And that means conservation has been a cornerstone of my presidency. Since taking office, I've protected more than 548 million acres of our lands and waters for our children and our grandchildren. I have to say that Teddy Roosevelt gets the credit for starting the national park system, but when you include a big chunk of the Pacific Ocean, we now have actually done more acreage than any other president. We've designated national monuments from Maine to Ohio to California. And just last week, thanks to the hard work of many people in this room, including Senator Schatz, I created the world's largest marine preserve, quadrupling the size of our monument at Papahano, Mokuakai. This is an area twice the size of Texas that's going to be protected and allows us to save and study the fragile ecosystem threatened by climate change.
This large stretch of ocean, encompassing more than 500,000 square miles off the coast of Hawaii, is the largest marine protected area on the planet. President Obama more than quadrupled the size of Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument last week, creating an ecologically protected area that is now more than twice the size of Texas. The monument was originally created in 2006 by former President George W. Bush and designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2010. Since then, new scientific exploration has revealed a slew of new species and deep-sea habitats in this region. The monument is a sanctuary for marine life and one of the most biologically diverse areas in the world. It is the planet's largest seabird gathering site with more than 14 million birds from 22 species. Scientists supporting the expansion say it'll protect more than 7,000 marine species, including endangered animals such as blue whales, sea turtles, and the last Hawaiian monk seals, as well as the world's oldest animal, a black coral estimated to be 4,500 years old. Environmentalists say as ocean warming and other impacts of climate change threaten marine ecosystems, the move will improve the resilience of oceans. And it'll create a natural laboratory for scientists to monitor the impacts of climate change on the waters and their ecological resources. The expanded area is also considered a sacred place for native Hawaiians, who use it for cultural and spiritual activities.
This is a hallowed site, and it deserves to be treated that way, and from now on it will be preserved for future generations.
With the designation, all commercial fishing and deep-sea mining is now prohibited within the expanded area. Despite the benefits to the ecosystem, some, including local fishermen, were against the expansion because of its potential impact on Hawaii's fishing industry.
So if we're going to leave our children with oceans like the ones that were left to us, then we're going to have to act. And we're going to have to act boldly. The health of our planet's oceans determine in large part the health of our own bodies and the health of our economies. And while it is our ocean's contours that shape our coastlines, it is what we decide and do here that will shape our ocean's future. And that's why my administration's protected more waters than any in history. Today we're building on this approach by establishing the first marine national monument in the Atlantic. We're protecting fragile ecosystems off the coast of New England, including pristine undersea canyons and seamounts. We're helping make the oceans more resilient to climate change. And so the investment that all of us together make here today is vital for our economy, it is vital for our foreign policy, it's vital for our national security, but it's also vital for our spirit. It's vital to who we are. Dangerous changes in our climate, caused mainly by human activity, dead zones in our ocean, caused mainly by pollution that we create here on land, unsustainable fishing practices, unprotected marine areas in which rare species and entire ecosystems are at risk. All those things are happening now. They've been happening for a long time. So if we're going to leave our children with oceans like the ones that were left to us, then we're going to have to act. And we're going to have to act boldly. And that's why the pledges and the partnerships from all of you at our Oceans Conference are so vital. The more than $4 billion that governments and philanthropies committed towards conservation at the first two gatherings here in Washington and in Chile, the more than 2 million square miles of ocean we came together to protect over these last 2 years, and what you'll add to those totals this week through more than 100 new initiatives and contributions, all of that's going to make a difference. It's probably not enough, but it's a pretty good down payment. And more importantly, it's signaling the fact that just as we did with the Paris Agreement, increasingly we are able to construct an international architecture that addresses some of these most vital environmental challenges in a serious way. One of the reasons I ran for president was to make sure that America does our part to protect our planet from future generations. And I am very proud that America has become a global leader in the fight against climate change. And while it is our ocean's contours that shape our coastlines, it is what we decide and do here that will shape our ocean's future. And that's why my administration's protected more waters than any in history. We established the first ever national oceans policy, which brings together government leaders with fishermen and boaters and researchers and everyday citizens, and ensures the decisions we make and resources we use are grounded in science. We crack down on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. We've created and expanded marine sanctuaries, and as John mentioned, just last month we created the largest marine protected area on Earth. It is now twice the size of Texas, home to more than 7,000 species, including some that are endangered and threatened. Our conservation efforts and our obligations to combat climate change in fact go hand in hand, because marine areas already have enough to worry about with overfishing and ship traffic and pollution, like those patches of plastic waste floating in the Pacific, and the invisible pollutants like carbon that we cannot see. The more of those threats that we eliminate through conservation, the more resilient those ecosystems will be to the consequences of climate change. So today we're building on this approach by establishing the first marine national monument in the Atlantic. We're protecting fragile ecosystems off the coast of New England, including pristine undersea canyons and seamounts. We're helping make the oceans more resilient to climate change, and this will help fishermen better understand the changes that are taking place that will affect their livelihood, and we're doing it in a way that respects the fishing industry's unique role in New England's economy and history. So I'm proud of what America's done, that we are doing our share. But it's no secret that we're all going to have to do a lot more, and we're going to have to do it fast. And that's why it's so critical that the tradition of this conference continues after John and I leave this office. That the EU so quickly raised its hand to host next year's Our Ocean Conference is a testament to the fact that these challenges demand collective action and deserve the world's attention. It's a recognition of the reality that the ocean's health is our health, and we've got our work cut out for us.
The high seas is home to life from the tiniest microscopic plankton all the way up to oceanic giants like the blue whale or oceanic white-tipped sharks. These are creatures that thrive in the emptiness of the blue open space.
The high seas make up about 2/3 of the world's ocean. It is a vast expanse beyond national jurisdiction, but ignored at our own peril.
The high seas is a life support system for the planet. It occupies virtually half of the space in this world, and that means that what goes on there really matters to all of us.
The health of the high seas impact the health of the entire network of ocean life and marine life as we know it.
Overfishing, climate change, mining, and other threats are wreaking havoc on the high seas, which lack centralized oversight from one governing body.
The high seas is currently managed by this patchwork of regional and international organizations that each have jurisdiction over certain types of activities. But this patchwork really doesn't provide adequate management because there's no coordination between these existing bodies and a lot of gaps exist.
In June 2015, the United Nations General Assembly took an important step to address these gaps by deciding to develop a new treaty for the high seas and convening a preparatory committee to start the process.
Resolution 69292, the enabling resolution, which kick-started the preparatory committee, was adopted by consensus. So that in itself shows that there is a willingness on the part of the international community to move forward So that's the starting point.
Governments will continue to meet to address the most pressing challenges to conserving high seas biodiversity, like an inability to establish marine reserves there.
Marine protected areas and marine reserves on the high seas will allow us to protect special places that are very vulnerable to human activities.
One of the things people have done to the environment over time is to degrade and deplete it. Marine protected areas will help reverse that trend, rebuilding life and enabling those ecosystems to be much more resilient to the sort of stresses and shocks that lie ahead.
While many leaders have created marine reserves in their national waters, protection is needed beyond those borders to meet these challenges.
The science says that we really need to be protecting something of the range of 30 to 40% of the oceans from exploitation and harm in order to safeguard life there. We can't possibly get to that number without protecting the high seas.
The UN is working toward that aim, and those close to the negotiation find reason for hope.
I was encouraged by what I witnessed as chair during the first session. There is a recognition that the time to act is now.
With this treaty, world leaders have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do something significant for the planet.
If we choose to do the right things and protect the planet better, reduce our impact on it, countless generations will benefit from that in the future.
I cannot think of the next generation of Palawans or the children of my children without a healthy ocean. It's important that we do what must be done, not eventually, but right now.
And again, the United Nations, Doug, just took over the seas. I don't think anybody realizes what that means. That means you'll have to have a United Nations permit to fish in the Everglades of Florida. That means you'll need a United Nations permit to go out on the three of the most famous trout fishing rivers in the world, actually are in Montana, the Gallatin, the Madison, the Yellowstone. Well, I could go on, the Rosebud. It seems like every one of the resources that used to be free to us are becoming more and more difficult. And I don't know, did you see that, Doug? Did you see that, Joe? With the United Nations is taking, okay. So, and let me ask you this, and please, did you guys even put into the framework of that means they'll control the food, whatever isn't radiated?
Food, can they not control, will they not control the traffic as well on the high seas?
Today is April the 11th, 2016. We are truly living in extraordinary times. We just witnessed a shadow government entity hold a $500 billion meeting in secret. We are witnessing the cancellation of the presidential election with the rigging of the delegate process. And now we have this. The United Nations wants to have total control over the world's oceans. The United Nations has launched a far-reaching initiative that could give UN-sponsored stakeholders sway over the biological resources of the high seas, all the waters that lie outside national territories and economic zones. The potential shift in power involves multi-trillion-dollar issues such as whether large areas, conceivably as much as 30% of the world's international waters, should be designated as no-go areas to protect biological diversity. So to me, it is very obvious what we are seeing here. This is the United Nations Wildlands Project, but for the oceans. And so really quick, in case you are not familiar, this map right here is the United Nations Wildlands Project. This is the fantasy the United Nations has for America. This map right here explains to us the reason why we are seeing Obama and the federal government steal land and protect it. They are protecting it from you and me so that we don't go on it. And so if this map is fully implemented, it says right here that the red, core reserves and corridors, little to no human use. You will not be allowed to touch this land if they have their way, and they are now trying to do the same thing with the oceans. They want to have no-go zones. So from there, it goes on to say whether and how to require elaborate environmental impact assessments for future ocean development projects, which basically translates out to you have to be a billionaire to do anything, and how to divide up the economic benefits from the future development of marine genetic resources. Now, I have no idea what they are talking about here. I'm going to guess that this is about genetically modified sea animals, but I could be completely wrong. The rationale, there's rationale. The rationale behind the discussions, easing the rising pressure on the world's undersea biodiversity wrought by overfishing, pollution, the drainage of nutrients and other substances from surrounding lands, disturbance of underwater seabeds, and fears of even greater threats from underwater industrial technology, including underwater exploration for hydrocarbons, and of course, they don't mention Fukushima. Shame on them. They refuse to admit and acknowledge the real problem going on, at least in the Pacific Ocean. And then further down in the article, this is the last line I'm going to cover. One of the biggest backers of the preliminary talks is the Obama administration. Gee, should we be surprised that Obama is one of the biggest cheerleaders for the United Nations taking over the oceans and declaring no-go zones? I mean, this is unbelievable. I really don't know what else to say about this other than the fact that our president is a traitor. He is submitting our country to foreign international bodies, and hardly anybody is doing anything to stop him.